Great to be here. Pete, nice to be with you as well, and a beautiful city. I love this city. Every time I get to come to Hungary, it is a gorgeous country, a gorgeous city. Thank you guys all for your hospitality and kindness. We have had a time of our lives being here, and it's really fun to learn and to listen to others and ideals. I got to tell you, before you and I get started, my children, I have 3 children, and they're like, Daddy, where are you going? I said, I'm going to Budapest. And he was like, where's that? And we got the map out and turned it and showed him where it was. And he goes, that's really far away, Daddy. I was like, that is very far away. He says, what are you doing over there? I said, we're going to have a conversation, and we're going to talk, and we're going to learn. And he says, so what's it like? And I said, you know what's cool about Budapest, about Hungary? They value families more than any other place I think I've seen around the world, and growing families. And I think you guys deserve a round of applause for what you've done standing up for families and what you've done to protect children in this country. And I just want to say, God bless you guys for doing that. I think it's amazing. Pete, I want to talk to you about money, following the money. The Biden woke agenda is very expensive. In the U.S., we're supposed to be giving out foreign aid and money to different countries to help. We're supposed to be helping people. What has now happened, and it's something that you've seen firsthand, is the amount of money leaving this country going to woke ideology, going to things that if most people realized where that money was going, they would have absolutely no clue. It's something that you worked on. Transparency in that money. Where is that money going, and what is it doing in the Trump administration? And I think that is something that is shocking when people say follow that money, where it actually goes. What was the most shocking thing when you were working in the Trump administration that you saw with U.S. aid and it being said, hey, we're doing great work, and in reality it was undermining family and undermining society?
Yes, well, thank you, and it is great to be back in Hungary. It's one of my favorite places to visit, and I'm glad to have my family with me this time. So, yes, it is. It's a real problem, and it was shocking to me, the stuff that I saw. Funding illegal abortions overseas. This was something that was amazing. It's not something that we would be allowed to do domestically. It's not something we are allowed to do overseas, but we would find money that was always hidden. I call it the Democrat word soup, right? It was liberal word soup. It was euphemisms. It was, hey, we're providing gender equity in healthcare access for teenage girls, and that's how they would couch it. You would have gay pride parades in the Balkans, and they would couch it as democracy. So it's always using a word to gloss over what they're actually doing. And one of the other problems with the money that I saw is even if you presume that some of these programs were actually legitimate, that they were actually doing something that had an interest for the American people, you would see that probably at best, you would be lucky if 50% or 2/3 of it actually made it outside of Washington, D.C., overseas to the people that it was intended to help. But the other problem that you have is a lot of the ways that foreign assistance, when it actually lands, is that it often assists the people that we are trying to prevent in their objective. And what I mean by that is we would often find USAID PACs in the hands of ISIS. You would find resources in the hands of terrorists.
How does that happen? I mean, because you would think that would be something as soon as it happened that immediately it would be stopped, and that's not what you found.
Well, you said the key word is money. The whole thing is just how do we get money out the door? But a lot of that is first delegated to some sort of NGO or something that's in Washington, D.C. And so that money never actually makes it overseas. And so when you have 9 layers in a vertical there's no oversight of that money and how it's actually being spent downrange, then you don't really have a good sense of who's actually receiving the money. And so many times the money is being used to exploit the very people that we are trying to assist.
It's interesting how there's different people in politics that are financially involved. One of those top names that we hear, not just in the U.S., but around the world, is George Soros. And George Soros has become an expert at what I would describe funneling money. Funneling money into his nonprofits, funneling money into organizations that he supports that are then pushing a political ideology all over the world. Talk a little bit about what you found there.
So, what you used to see, I think, was a closer relationship that was more transparent on the surface between the Open Societies Foundation or other organizations where money would come in at the high level in the form of grants or something from the U.S. government. But now they've become much more crafty about this. And so money is filtered down at the low level, at the bottom of the vertical, through whether it's a transition initiative or something like that, where money is fed at the lowest local level in a country. And ideally, that's where something good could happen. But if there's no oversight, then who knows who it's going to. So the money goes into the bottom level of that vertical, and it's filtered up through the organization to the Soros network. And we've seen this across Latin America, where it actually encouraged illegal migration into the United States. And so here you actually had the U.S. government giving grants to organizations that were funding and supporting movement, illegal movement, into the United States to cross the border.
Crisis brings opportunity for people to exploit situations, whether it be American aid going to Ukraine, whether it be going to deal with issues with global warming, for example. You and I talked about this, that global warming initiatives have actually gone to fund, through aid, different people that were involved in what they refer to as terrorism. Talk a little bit about these opportunities and how people are exploiting these moments where they say, there's a crisis, we know money's going to come in from this, and then we get to do what we really want to do with this money.
Again, this is euphemistic word soup. And this is where people love to use words like climate change drives terrorism across the Sahel and Africa. And the fact is that's just not true. And the way I saw this actually play out was that you would have this narrative, and you would get these tons of money behind it. You'd get congressmen, championing it and saying we need to spend more money on climate change because that's what's driving terrorism in Nigeria. And so I'd
say that again. It's laughable on its face, but if you do any thought processing the absurdity of it, and that's what they were actually selling.
It is, but this is where they try to sound technical. They try to, again, the science, right? They'll all tell you the science. And I said, well, let's look at the science. And so one of the things we did in the bureau that I led was, one of the things that Trump was really big on was data-driven policy. Imagine that. Policy that was based in facts, not just, Washington isms. And so we looked at this story of is climate change related to some sort of migration pattern that is driving violence? It simply is not true. We looked at the overlays of where the violence was taking place, who was conducting the violence, where are the grazing lands, where is the water supply, is there more crop cover and rainfall? So we did all of that analysis. And so we would go to the other bureaus and we would talk to the other parts of the U.S. government and say, you're selling this narrative. It's just not true. So let's talk about it. And unfortunately, it takes a lot of people to get those truths, fleshed out, and everybody's got to sign off on it. But unfortunately, that was not the policy. And still today, you'll hear AOC, championing this initiative and others. But the bottom line is, it's just not true.
One of the things I think is the scariest thing about government, whether it's in the U.S. or around the world, is how quickly government can undermine family, how quickly they can undermine traditional values, how quickly they can incentivize you to make bad choices instead of good choices. One of the things we were talking about with Prime Minister Orban yesterday was the fact that you guys have incentivized families to stay together, whereas many countries, including the U.S., we have incentivized people for making bad choices to be single parents and not have a two-person household. You've incentivized families to grow and have children, instead of incentivizing people to say, have another kid out of wedlock and we'll give you more money. And what happened when you do that, we've seen it in Hungary, is families stay together. Yet so many times government aid, especially from the U.S., unfortunately now, has been radicalized to break down families and traditional values. How big of a concern is that for you? How big of a concern should it be for the world? You saw this firsthand when you were in the Trump administration. It's something that I'm terrified of, is that we are taking and breaking down the family, not just in the U.S., but we're seeing a breakdown worldwide.
So it concerns me on many levels. It concerns me because, one, I think that if you're not protecting the core political unit, then you have no policy. You have no domestic policy. You can't have a foreign policy if you don't have a domestic policy. And when I say the core political unit, I'm not talking about the central government or federal or state or local. I'm talking about the family. And one of the things that I saw in conflict zones, and I've spent too much of my life in conflict zones, is an erosion of the family. And there's a very deliberate information warfare that takes place on the family, eroding people's core identity, eroding the meaning of their family and their stability. And so we know that destabilizes communities. We know that destabilizes countries. And so when we're pushing narratives that are not consistent with promoting good family values, it is having a negative impact. And so to see that there is actually money being put behind that is extremely troubling. And so I know that I've seen this over the past couple of years in Texas myself. I'm concerned about the fact that so much money has been put into school board elections. I mean, why on earth would you think school board elections would be so targeted by groups like Soros? But they are, and it was very smart because, all of a sudden people are saying, well, pay no attention to this woke agenda.
You can change a generation in one school cycle.
Absolutely.
You can change a society in one school cycle of children. If you can change the minds of children, which is the most valuable thing to the woke left agenda, if you can turn them against parents, having 3 small kids, I see this now, and it terrifies me, how corporations, how governments, how nonprofits are trying to turn children against their own parents and their traditional family values.
And this is exactly what we saw, and people don't want to talk about it, but the reality is you've got these extremist Muslim groups coming into the Balkans, and they set up these parajamats, these house mosques, right across the street from schools. They know that the kids are vulnerable. This is where they target us. They target children in their recruiting efforts. And so we know this, and yet we're still funding these groups. We would find I forgot to mention another example that I was completely shocked by, was that we were funding groups that were funding, ultimately funding the feeding schools that would feed those schools. And so we have to be more careful about how we spend foreign assistance and how we send money out the door. We're not taking care of it. We're not being good stewards of it. And so we have to be very careful of that.
Well, lastly, I want to talk about protecting our kids in general from not just government, but this money that is so powerful. What do we need to do differently? And I'm talking about on the world stage to make sure that we are not allowing this cash to be used against parents, to be used to indoctrinate children. We see it in movies. We see it in culture. We see it in music. We see it in all of the things, social media, TikTok, the list goes on, where kids are, in my opinion, brainwashed to believe that these radical ideals, transgenderism, changing, not knowing if you're a boy or a girl, is part of growing up. It's part of adolescence. It's part of a normal, youth. It's being indoctrinated in them. And many parents, I don't think, realize how much of an impact it's having on their own families. And then all of a sudden they wake up one day and their kids look at their parents and they say, we hate you. We hate what you stand for. And that's not a conservative or a liberal thing. It's terrifying that we're watching governments and nonprofits work together to do that.
So this was another concern that I raised that I really couldn't get much traction on, and people looked at me with cross eyes when I said this, but I am very concerned about what a generation I'm calling the global digital natives. Global digital natives. And when I say that, I mean kids that are being raised by TikTok, being raised by global organizations, movements that they're not taking pride in who they are. They're not taking pride in their national identity. They're being raised with the idea that their identity makes them either a victim or makes them a criminal. And this whole idea of grabbing a hold of people's identity and messing with it and saying, you're wrong because you're in the family. That's something this is what our adversaries do. They do it very effectively across the African continent. I saw it frequently over there. If you can erode people's core identity of family and how they see themselves, then that's the best way you can erode a community and weaken it to manipulate it however you want.
Pete, last question for you, and that deals with this upcoming election in the U.S. If your old boss, Donald Trump, wins the nomination and is able to become president again, how much of a fighter is he? How much is he going to walk into that Oval Office and empower men just like you to really go in, take the gloves off, and to clean house and to fight for the things you're talking about today?
Wow. Well, I'll tell you, it was an incredible honor, probably one of the greatest honors of my life, to serve in the America First policy. And I'm so optimistic about the idea that we can have a policy one day again that can come back, that can allow us to focus on our priorities and not apologize for self-interest. It's the same thing every country should do. I think if Donald Trump is the person that makes it back into the Oval Office in 2025, I think we should be prepared for something amazing, something very different. And I think that no matter how the election takes place, whatever transpires there, I'll tell you what, it would be a great honor to serve again. So we'll see.
To all of you, thank you for having us here. It is a pleasure to be back in Hungary. Thank you guys so much. Have a great rest of your day.